Welcome, dear listener, and thank you for joining me tonight. As the world outside grows quiet and you prepare to rest, I invite you to drift with me into the warmth of history's embrace. Tonight, we travel to the golden sands of ancient Egypt, to an age of temples and pharaohs, of myths carved into stone and dreams carried upon the river Nile. It is the year 1500 before the Common Era. The city of Thebes stirs in the soft light of dawn. The first rays of the sun spill across the limestone cliffs, igniting their pale surfaces in hues of rose and gold. Along the banks of the river, palm trees sway gently in the morning breeze, their silhouettes mirrored in the still water. Fishermen push their reed boats into the current, casting nets that glimmer faintly in the rising light. From the distance, the faint call of ibises can be heard, mingling with the low chant of priests greeting the day. The air carries the fragrance of incense, drifting from temple courtyards where offerings are already being made to the gods. Torches, dim from the night, are slowly extinguished, their smoke curling upward like threads into the sky. In the heart of the city, stone temples stand in solemn majesty, massive pylons carved with hieroglyphs, their walls already centuries old, yet ever renewed with offerings of devotion. And in this world, among the priests and artisans, soldiers and scribes, there is a child whose destiny is unlike any other. She is Hatshepsut, daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I, born into the very heart of power. She grows up not in shadows but beneath the vast colonnades of Thebes, her footsteps echoing in the same halls where gods are honored and kings are crowned. Picture her as the morning sun rises, a young girl wrapped in fine linen, her dark hair brushed and bound with golden clasps. She walks slowly behind her attendants, her eyes sharp and curious, her presence calm yet commanding even at a tender age. To the people of Egypt, she is already marked with the aura of the divine, a princess destined to continue the line of kings. Yet no one, perhaps not even she herself, could imagine that one day she would seize not only the title of queen, but also the throne of Pharaoh, remaking the very image of kingship in her own form. For now, though, the air is filled not with whispers of ambition but with the rhythm of daily life. Thebes glitters in the morning sun, its marketplaces buzzing with chatter, its courtyards alive with servants preparing feasts, its temple steps alive with barefoot pilgrims. The river, eternal and endless, glides past the city, carrying barges laden with grain, wine, and offerings for the gods. And in its reflection, the young princess sees not only her face, but the shimmer of a kingdom waiting for her touch. As you listen, imagine yourself walking through those ancient streets. The stones beneath your feet are warm from the sun, the scent of bread and honey drifts from the baker's shop, and above you loom the high walls of temples painted with the colors of the gods. You pause at the banks of the Nile and watch the current flow, steady and unstoppable, much like the fate of Egypt itself. Hatshepsut's story begins here, on these sacred banks, in the quiet beauty of Thebes. Yet hers is not only a tale of crowns and monuments. It is a story of transformation, of how a woman, expected only to serve as daughter, wife, and mother, dared to step beyond the limits of her role. She would stand in the very place of kings, donning the beard, the crown, the symbols of male authority, and declare herself Pharaoh. But that moment lies far ahead. For now, let us linger in the calm of dawn. The air is cool, the city stirs gently, and the Nile flows as it has for millennia, whispering softly to the shores it nourishes. This river, eternal and patient, will one day carry ships to foreign lands at her command, and its waters will reflect temples she herself orders to be built. But in this first light, it reflects only the innocence of a young princess, curious, watchful, and quietly preparing to shape her destiny. As you rest tonight, allow yourself to drift upon that river, to feel the calm flow beneath you, carrying you further into her story. From the golden courtyards of Thebes to the hushed chambers of the royal palace, from the incense-filled temples to the whispers of court intrigue, we will follow the path of Hatshepsut. The girl on the riverbank will become a queen. The queen will become a king. And in doing so, she will carve her name not only into the stone of temples, but into the memory of history itself. So close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the Nile's gentle current guide you. Our journey into her world has only just begun. Thebes, heart of Egypt, was not merely a city. It was a living monument, pulsing with the glory of gods and kings. Towering pylons greeted the dawn, their walls etched with hymns that stretched back centuries. Priests in white linen filed into sacred halls, their chants echoing against colossal statues. Traders shouted in markets overflowing with spices, incense, and gold. The river Nile carried ships heavy with grain from the fertile delta, ivory from Nubia, cedar wood from Lebanon. Egypt stood at its peak, a land where the gods seemed to walk beside mortals. Amid this grandeur, a child grew. Her name was Hatshepsut. She was not like other children who played in the streets or helped their mothers grind grain. She was born into the royal household, where every step she took echoed against polished stone floors, and every breath carried the weight of divine expectation. Imagine her as a girl of 7 or 8, her hair cut short in the royal style, her small frame wrapped in linen finer than most would ever touch. She darted through temple courtyards, her sandals slapping against smooth stone, as towering columns rose around her like a forest of painted reeds. Priests paused in their duties to bow, yet she was still young enough to giggle and race past them, the sound of her laughter mixing with the low drone of prayers. Her education was unlike any ordinary child's. Tutors drilled her in reading hieroglyphs, the sacred language carved into temple walls. She learned mathematics, how to measure fields and calculate harvests, for one day she might oversee Egypt's wealth. She studied the myths of gods and goddesses, learning not only their names but their symbols and powers. And in the private gardens of the palace, priests whispered the secrets of rituals, teaching her how incense must be offered, how hymns must be sung, how the gods must be honored to keep Egypt safe. But even as a child, Hatshepsut's mind reached further. She did not seem satisfied with the narrow roles prescribed for women of her station. Where others might have focused on preparing for marriage, she pressed her tutors with questions about dynasties and battles, about pharaohs who had carved their names into eternity. She wanted to know not only how to pray, but how to command. One day, when she was scarcely 10 years old, she was led into a grand temple ceremony. The hall was filled with the scent of burning myrrh, its columns painted with stars, its statues looming like guardians. Nobles in gleaming jewelry stood shoulder to shoulder, while priests carried sacred vessels lined with gold. It was a ritual meant to honor Ammonius, the hidden god, and the child princess had been given a role. She was small compared to the towering figures around her, yet when she stepped forward, silence rippled through the hall. She lifted a jug of wine with steady hands, her eyes unflinching as she poured the offering upon the altar. The priests chanted, their voices rising and falling, but all eyes were on her. Even the high priest later murmured that the girl carried herself with the composure of someone far older, as though the gods themselves steadied her hand. That moment lingered in memory. Courtiers whispered afterward that Hatshepsut was no ordinary princess. Something about her presence filled the chamber, a command that could not be taught, only born. Contrast this picture now, the innocence of a child running through courtyards, laughter echoing between columns, and that same child standing before the gods with solemn poise, as if already rehearsing for the throne. She was both, innocent and commanding, playful and powerful. Yet the balance tilted slowly toward destiny. Egypt at its height demanded rulers who could embody both god and mortal, both strength and subtlety. Hatshepsut, even as a girl, seemed to walk that line with ease. She absorbed the lessons of her father's court not as obligations, but as opportunities. Her eyes lingered on the throne longer than most realized. The Nile flowed endlessly outside, its waters carrying wealth and power. But within Thebes, within the heart of its temples, a princess was beginning to shape her path. A path that would defy tradition, challenge centuries of expectation, and one day transform her from daughter and wife into pharaoh. For now, she remained a child. Yet her first steps into ritual, her bright curiosity, and her unmistakable presence marked her as something more. Already, whispers began, this girl was not only destined to stand beside kings. She might, one day, stand as king herself. The years passed, and the playful girl of Thebes ripened into a woman of striking presence. By the time she reached her late teens, the path laid before her was clear. As was customary among the royal house of Egypt, her destiny was bound to her bloodline. She was married to her half-brother, Thutmose II. To modern ears it may sound strange, even unsettling, yet within Egypt's traditions it was sacred. By wedding within the royal line, the god's blood remained pure, the throne preserved unbroken. The palace into which Hatshepsut entered as wife shimmered with grandeur. Imagine vast courtyards, their limestone floors gleaming white beneath the desert sun. Incense smoke drifted lazily through painted halls, curling around lotus-shaped columns. At banquets, tables groaned under platters of roasted geese, honey cakes, figs, and jars of sweet wine. Musicians plucked the strings of harps as dancers moved like living hieroglyphs, graceful and fluid in the golden light of oil lamps. The air was thick with perfume, frankincense, myrrh, cedar, imported from across the seas, all to please the gods and remind the courtiers of Egypt's unmatched wealth. Hatshepsut appeared at these gatherings wrapped in linen so sheer it shimmered like moonlight, her arms heavy with bracelets of gold, her neck encircled with turquoise and lapis lazuli. Yet beyond the ornaments, what truly set her apart was her bearing. She walked not as one who sought favor, but as one who expected it. Her words were calm, deliberate, often spoken in the pauses between feasts and ceremonies, yet courtiers found themselves leaning closer to catch every syllable. Whispers began to ripple through the palace walls. While Thutmose II wore the crown, it was his wife whose eyes seemed sharper, whose judgment struck deeper. He was a man of frail health, more at ease in the shadow of advisors than in the spotlight of command. She, by contrast, radiated energy, her posture upright, her gaze steady, her voice carrying weight even in silence. In the council chambers, where matters of taxes, temples, and foreign envoys were discussed, Hatshepsut often lingered. Officially, she sat as queen consort, the great royal wife, a role meant to support and advise. Unofficially, she absorbed every word, asked pointed questions, and offered solutions that outshone even the scribes and ministers. Some rolled their eyes in secrecy, others marveled at her mind. It was said that when disputes arose among priests, they found it more effective to seek her judgment than her husband's. A story is told of one evening when the priests of Ammonius could not agree on the allocation of temple lands. Voices grew sharp, parchment maps scattered across the floor. Thutmose II, weary and pale, struggled to speak over them. It was Hatshepsut who finally rose. She stepped forward, her linen robes whispering against the stone, and in a tone both firm and measured, laid out a plan that balanced the temple's needs with the crown's treasury. The room fell quiet. Even the high priest, after a pause, bowed his head. Thutmose II accepted the resolution, but everyone present knew the hand that had truly guided it. The palace was a theater of appearances, but within its shadowed corridors, the roles were shifting. Hatshepsut did not storm or seize, she simply acted, and others followed. She honored the gods, presided at rituals, and bore the title of Great Royal Wife. But within her mind, something more was stirring. The position was not enough. She had tasted the power that came from decisions, from order, from being listened to with reverence. And she recognized how fragile her husband was, how uncertain the throne might become should fate strike too soon. At banquets, she smiled as musicians played and goblets clinked. Yet behind her calm eyes, ambition smoldered like embers beneath ash. To courtiers, she was the perfect queen, graceful and wise. To herself, she was already rehearsing for a greater role, one that would demand not only robes of linen, but the double crown of Egypt. The Nile flowed beyond palace walls, carrying ships laden with tribute. Life in Egypt appeared steady, unshaken. Yet within the golden halls of Thebes, a transformation was underway. A queen was rising, not content to remain in the shadow of her husband. Slowly, quietly, Hatshepsut began to act not only as wife, but as ruler in all but name. And as the desert night wrapped the palace in silence, her thoughts turned toward the future. She was not merely born to be a consort. She was born to rule. The years of Hatshepsut's marriage drifted like the slow turning of the Nile. Banquets came and went, offerings were made to the gods, and the palace carried on its rhythm of ritual and politics. Yet beneath the polished stone and golden crowns, human frailty could not be hidden forever. Thutmose too, always frail, grew weaker with each passing season. His body, though wrapped in silks and jewels, betrayed him. Courtiers whispered of fevers, of a cough that lingered too long, of a ruler whose strength was more symbol than substance. And then, almost as quietly as his reign had begun, it ended. One day, the palace fell into a hushed stillness. The king was dead. Imagine the torchlit corridors of Thebes that night, shadows trembling on walls painted with gods and pharaohs of old. The sound of sandals echoed as priests hurried to prepare the royal body for its eternal journey. Incense burned heavy in the air, not as perfume but as mourning. The double crown of Egypt, gleaming with red and white, was set aside. The question that haunted the palace was simple yet perilous: who would wear it next? The answer was, in truth, already known. The heir was Thutmose III, son of a lesser wife of Thutmose II. He was blood of the royal line, but still only a child, barely old enough to hold a scepter, let alone command armies or temples. Egypt could not be left adrift. Someone must rule in his name. That someone was Hatshepsut. She was still young herself, not yet 30, but she carried the titles of Great Royal Wife and God's Wife of Ammonius. Her lineage was unimpeachable, her presence commanding. With the boy king too small to govern, Hatshepsut was named regent, entrusted to guide Egypt until Thutmose III came of age. At first, she accepted the role with grace, draped in black linen of mourning. She stood beside the tiny pharaoh, her hand resting gently on his shoulder as officials and priests bowed before them. To outward eyes, she was the grieving widow, the dutiful stepmother, a woman carrying the burden of guardianship. But within her heart, a new sensation stirred. For the first time, she held not just influence, but the full weight of authority. And it fit her like a garment woven long ago, waiting for this moment. Day by day, her responsibilities grew. She presided over councils where generals debated border defenses and scribes read out tax accounts. She sat in temple courts, hearing disputes between merchants and priests. Decisions once deferred to kings now flowed through her hands. And she did not falter. A story is told of a dispute between two noble families over sacred farmland. The priests of Ammonius gathered, parchment scrolls spread before them. The boy king sat silently, fidgeting with a golden amulet. But when the voices rose too loud, Hatshepsut raised her hand. The room fell silent. She spoke calmly, weighing the gods' favor and Egypt's need, and decreed the land be divided in a manner both fair and clever. The priests, after murmurs, bowed their heads. Even in mourning robes, she radiated the authority of a pharaoh. The people, too, began to see her differently. In markets, mothers whispered her name with a mix of awe and comfort. In temples, her offerings were said to be more abundant than those of her late husband. Soldiers marching along the Nile heard tales of a queen who ruled like a king, her judgment swift, her presence unshaken. And yet, amid the incense and ritual, there was tenderness too. Hatshepsut was not cruel to the boy Thutmose. She appeared with him at ceremonies, allowed him the symbols of kingship, and taught him the rituals of the gods. But the truth grew clearer with each passing year: though he bore the crown, it was she who bore the power. At night, she walked the courtyards of the temple of Ammonius, the moonlight painting her face silver. Priests bowed as she passed, murmuring blessings. Once, this deference had been reserved for pharaohs. Now it was given to her. She felt its weight, and its thrill. In those long hours, perhaps she reflected on her childhood lessons, on the Medjay guards who spoke of loyalty, on the priests who whispered of destiny. She had been told she was chosen by the gods, beloved of Ammonius himself. Now, standing in the heart of Egypt, she wondered if those words were not mere ceremony, but prophecy. For what began as temporary regency was slowly hardening into something permanent. The courtiers no longer looked past her to the boy king. They looked at her directly. When decisions needed making, when the Nile's floods needed measuring, when foreign envoys demanded answers, it was her voice that carried weight. Hatshepsut had stepped into power quietly, respectfully, in the guise of service. But now, the line between regent and ruler blurred with each sunrise. Egypt, land of gods and pharaohs, had begun to accept a truth whispered at first, then spoken openly. This widow was not simply guarding the throne. She was shaping it for herself. The Nile carried on, its waters swelling with life, its banks glowing beneath the sun. But within the palaces of Thebes, the balance of power had shifted forever. And in the hush of candlelight, Hatshepsut may have allowed herself a thought both thrilling and dangerous: why return this power, when it has already become mine? The years of regency passed like the steady flow of the Nile. The boy Thutmose grew, but still the shadow of power clung not to him, but to his stepmother. Egypt had begun to see her not as a placeholder, but as the true hand guiding the kingdom. And then, one morning, as the sun rose above the pylons of Karnak, a decision was made that would change Egypt forever. Hatshepsut would no longer rule as regent. She would rule as pharaoh. It was a step no woman had taken so boldly. There had been queens before, Ahotep, Nefersobek, but always framed as caretakers, rare exceptions. Hatshepsut, however, sought not exception but permanence. She would not return the crown. She would wear it. The court gathered in hushed anticipation. Imagine the vast temple courtyard, incense coiling upward like whispers to the gods, drums echoing through stone halls carved with images of eternal kingship. Priests of Ammonius lined the stairways, their linen robes glowing white in the morning sun. Courtiers leaned forward, wondering if rumor could truly become reality. Then came Hatshepsut. No longer dressed in the flowing gowns of a queen, she appeared in the regalia of kingship itself. Upon her brow gleamed the cobra diadem, uraeus shining in the sunlight, ready to strike at all who threatened Egypt. Around her waist was tied the shendit, the pleated kilt of pharaohs. Across her chest, a golden collar shimmered with turquoise and lapis. But most startling of all, upon her chin, fastened with cords of gold, was the false beard, the sacred emblem of the king. The crowd gasped. Some bowed low in reverence, others exchanged looks of astonishment. A woman, dressed as a man, yet more regal than any king who had come before. The priests raised their arms, voices chanting hymns to Ammonius Ra, declaring her chosen by the gods. A scroll was read aloud, proclaiming her titles: Motker Hatshepsut, the perfect embodiment of Ra's truth, the pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt. The very language reshaped itself around her, words once reserved for men now applied to her without hesitation. Yet not all were ready to accept. Some whispered she had overreached, that she had stolen a crown meant for her stepson. Generals shifted uneasily, uncertain whether to kneel. Nobles who favored tradition frowned, fearing chaos. But Hatshepsut stood tall, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. She declared herself not a usurper, but the rightful ruler, chosen by the god Ammonius himself. And here lies the brilliance of her transformation. She did not deny her womanhood, she reimagined it. In inscriptions, she called herself daughter of Ammonius, yet also his son, born of his body. She blurred the line between male and female, mortal and divine. She became not simply a woman pretending to be a man, but a figure above both, a living embodiment of kingship itself. One story tells of her coronation feast. The tables overflowed with bread, figs, honey, and roasted geese, while musicians played harps beneath the painted ceilings. As foreign envoys entered, they bowed not to the child Thutmose but to her. She met their eyes with calm assurance, as if to say, Egypt does not wait for men to grow into crowns. Egypt already has its king. The people, too, began to adapt. On temple walls, artists carved her figure as a man with broad shoulders, yet still inscribed her name with the feminine ending. In statues, she appeared both with and without the beard, both queen and king. She became a paradox that no one dared challenge. A woman who had rewritten the very image of Pharaoh. Still, in quiet chambers, the debate raged. Was this blasphemy, or divine will? Was she preserving Egypt, or breaking its traditions? Yet in the silence of the Nile's eternal flow, the truth became clear: she had claimed power, and she would not relinquish it. Picture her standing atop the steps of Karnak, the false beard glinting in the sun, her gaze cast down the avenue of sphinxes. Around her, the courtiers bowed. Behind her, the boy Thutmose was guided gently away, his crown more symbolic than sovereign. And in that moment, Egypt witnessed a transformation unlike any other. The widow had become pharaoh, and the line between king and queen had been erased. For centuries to come, her reign would be debated, her choice both praised and condemned. But in that morning light, beneath the chants of the priests, one truth was undeniable: Hatshepsut had remade kingship in her own image. And as the sun climbed higher, its rays catching the river Nile in shimmering reflection, Egypt itself seemed to accept the change. The gods had spoken through her, and the land, weary of uncertainty, was ready to follow. With the crown firmly upon her head, Hatshepsut turned her gaze not toward conquest or endless wars, but toward creation. Where other kings measured their reigns by battlefields and trophies, she measured hers by the rise of stone, by the way monuments could catch the sun and speak to eternity. Her years as pharaoh ushered in peace and prosperity. The Nile's floods were generous, the fields yielded abundant grain, and trade routes hummed with life. Egypt, under her hand, was not a land of turmoil but of steady breath, like the rhythmic rise and fall of the river itself. And into this calm, she wove her vision, to make Egypt magnificent, to etch her name into the very bones of the earth. Across the land, she ordered great building projects. Temples to the gods were restored, new shrines erected, pylons raised higher than before. But she was not content with simple additions. Her imagination demanded grandeur. She commanded the construction of obelisks, slender spires of granite that pierced the sky. At Karnak, her artisans dragged and lifted blocks that weighed more than entire houses. One obelisk alone, carved from a single piece of red granite at Aswan, rose to nearly 100 feet, its tip flashing gold when it caught the morning sun. Inscribed upon its sides were her titles, her prayers, and her claim, that she, Hatshepsut, chosen of Ammonius, ruled by divine will. The people marveled at these towering monuments. To them, obelisks were the rays of the sun made solid, proof that the gods favored their pharaoh. And in their height and permanence, Hatshepsut wrote a message not just for her time, but for all time: I was here. I reigned. I endured. Yet her crowning jewel, the monument that even now speaks her name across millennia, was her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. Nestled against the cliffs of western Thebes, it rose in sweeping terraces, a vision of harmony between man's hand and nature's strength. Imagine walking toward it as the morning sun poured over limestone walls, columns glowing pale gold against the shadow of the cliffs. Ramps ascended in perfect balance, leading to pillared courts and sanctuaries that seemed to dissolve into the rock itself. This temple was not merely a tomb. It was a statement. Its walls told stories of divine birth, of trade expeditions, of her reign as a pharaoh chosen by Ammonius. On one panel, she appeared as a woman, slender and robed, receiving the blessings of the gods. On another, she appeared as a man, broad-shouldered, crowned and bearded, offering sacrifices. The artisans carved her in both forms, shifting seamlessly between them, as if to say, she was not bound by one image. She was both. She was all. Picture the courtyards filled with artisans at work. The chisel striking stone in rhythmic beats, dust rising in golden shafts of sunlight. Painters grinding pigments of blue and red, mixing them with water to color gods and kings. Overseers directing gangs of workers who sang to keep time as they hauled blocks up ramps. Every stroke of hammer and brush was another thread in the tapestry of her immortality. For the people of Egypt, such projects were not simply labor. They were devotion. To build a pharaoh's temple was to ensure one's place in the eternal balance of Ma'at, the harmony of the universe. And under Hatshepsut's reign, work was steady, wages fair, and Egypt flourished in stability. Travelers from afar would later describe Egypt under her as a place of wonder. Foreign envoys stood in awe before her obelisks. Merchants brought home stories of the queen who ruled like a king, who built as though she commanded the very mountains. And in markets along the Nile, parents told their children that their pharaoh was unlike any before her, stronger for her peace than others were for their wars. Yet behind this beauty, there was strategy. Hatshepsut knew that kings were remembered less for their laws and more for their stone. Armies might win battles, but time would erode their glory. Monuments, however, would endure. By covering Egypt in her likeness, sometimes as a man, sometimes as a woman, she ensured that no one could erase her from memory without chiseling through mountains. And so, she rewrote her legacy in stone. Each obelisk a prayer to eternity, each wall carving a defiance against time. The cliffs of Deir el-Bahari became her voice, whispering across centuries, "I was Pharaoh, I was chosen, I was eternal." As the years passed, Egypt glowed with her creations. Farmers looked up from their fields and saw the obelisks glinting in the sun. Priests offered incense in temples built by her command. Children played in the shadow of walls that bore her name. And though whispers still lingered in the court, of scandal, of tradition broken, those whispers were drowned out by the silence of stone, a silence that promised permanence. When night fell, and the moonlight turned her temple silver, the cliffs themselves seemed to cradle her monument like a mother holding her child. And perhaps Hatshepsut, standing in those courtyards, knew she had done something no enemy, no critic, no passage of years could undo. She had built her reign into eternity. Not every pharaoh is remembered for conquest. Some etched their names in blood, carving their legacy with spears and chariots. But Hatshepsut chose another path. She turned her gaze not toward battlefields but toward the horizon, where the Nile met the sea, and beyond it, lands of wonder whispered in legend. She dreamed of Punt. The land of the gods, the scribes called it, a place of incense and myrrh, of gold and ivory, of animals unseen in Egypt's fields. For centuries, its location was half myth, half memory, a place spoken of in temple hymns. But under Hatshepsut, Punt would no longer be only a story. It would become a destination. Picture the harbor at Thebes as dawn breaks. Wooden ships line the banks, their sails furled, their hulls painted with protective symbols. The smell of pitch and resin fills the air as carpenters hammer the final nails, while priests murmur blessings to the river god Happy. Rows of oarsmen sit ready, their muscles gleaming in the morning sun. The decks are piled with gifts, glass beads, weapons, fine linens, to trade with the mysterious people of Punt. And above it all, banners flutter with the royal insignia of Hatshepsut, declaring that this was no raid, but a mission of peace. Allies, it was genius, she embodied both, transcending limits. To her enemies, it was blasphemy, a rewriting of truth itself. One by one, she faced those who opposed her. A general stripped of command, his estate seized. A priest quietly removed from his temple, his statue left to crumble in the sand. These acts were not loud, not drenched in blood. They were silent, like a stone shifting in the night, steady and undeniable. And still, she remained calm. Where others would have lashed out, she stood in silence, cloaked in dignity. She hosted banquets where her voice was soft but decisive. She visited temples where incense rose around her like divine protection. To the people, she was Pharaoh, no longer questioned, no longer doubted. But in the quiet corners of Thebes, in the chambers where scribes whispered and generals exchanged glances, another truth lingered. Hatshepsut had risen higher than any woman before her. And the higher one rises, the longer the shadows stretch. In the hush of the desert winds, those shadows whispered of a time when her calm authority might no longer hold, when the balance she had built could tilt into chaos. Yet for now, she stood unshaken, her gaze steady as the Nile's eternal flow. The years of Hatshepsut's reign drifted on like the steady Nile. Peace endured, monuments rose, and Egypt's prosperity seemed eternal. Yet even pharaohs are mortal. Around 1458 BCE, after more than 2 decades upon the throne, the sultry queen who had crowned herself king slipped quietly from the stage of life. Her death came not with spectacle, but with silence. No great war had undone her, no rebellion toppled her throne. She passed away in her palace at Thebes, leaving behind obelisks piercing the sky, temples glowing in sunlight, and trade routes humming with riches. To her people, it must have felt impossible, that the figure carved in eternal stone could vanish from mortal breath. At first, she was honored as any pharaoh would be. Priests carried her body to its resting place in the Valley of the Kings, laying her among ancestors and rulers whose names echoed through centuries. Incense burned, hymns rose, and her spirit was commended to Osiris, Lord of the afterlife. Egypt seemed poised to remember her as one of its great sovereigns. But memory is fragile, and power breeds resentment. Her stepson, Thutmose III, now a grown man, finally took the throne in full. For years, he had been king in name only, living in the long shadow of his stepmother. Now, with her gone, the throne was his alone. And soon, a strange campaign began, not of conquest, but of erasure. Across Egypt, her images were struck down. Statues were toppled from their pedestals, their serene faces shattered into the sand. Walls that had once proclaimed her titles were chiseled bare, her cartouches gouged away as though her name had never been written. Reliefs in her magnificent temple at Deir el-Bahari were hacked into silence. It was as though Egypt itself The fleet set sail, their sails catching the wind, oars dipping in unison. Down the Nile they glided, then out into the Red Sea, their prows cutting through waters that shimmered beneath the sun. For days they traveled, past unfamiliar coasts, through currents that tossed the ships like toys. The horizon seemed endless, the line between sea and sky dissolving into a dream. And then, at last, Punt appeared. Imagine it, a shoreline lined with strange trees, thick with incense and gum, their scent drifting across the water. Huts stood on stilts, perched above sandy ground. Smoke curled from fires where families gathered. And around them moved creatures the Egyptians had never seen, monkeys leaping in branches, leopards prowling at the edges, birds with feathers shimmering like jewels. The people of Punt greeted the Egyptians not with weapons, but with open hands. They wore skins and jewelry of shell and gold, their hair bound with beads. Hatshepsut's envoys stepped ashore, bowing and offering gifts. In return, the rulers of Punt presented riches beyond measure, gold gleaming in the sunlight, tusks of ivory stacked like pillars, baskets. For years, Egypt had basked in the light of Hatshepsut's reign, temples rising, markets thriving, ships returning with treasures. Yet where there is light, shadows always grow. And the higher her star ascended, the longer and darker those shadows became. Whispers wound their way through the palace halls of Thebes. Courtiers, draped in linen and gold, lowered their voices when her name was spoken. A woman upon the throne, some muttered, unnatural, against the order of Ma'at. Others feared what it meant for the young Thutmose III, who lingered in her shadow like a figure waiting for his moment. Was he king in name only? Would he ever rule in truth? The generals of Egypt eyed the situation with unease. They had marched under the banners of pharaohs for generations, their loyalty bound by the promise of campaigns and conquest. Yet under Hatshepsut, Egypt's spears were kept sheathed. The army drilled, but it did not march. The smiths forged bronze, but few blades tasted blood. Egypt thrived not on war, but on trade, diplomacy, and stone. Some praised this peace. Others saw it as weakness. The priests, too, felt the strain. Though she had wrapped herself in divine imagery, calling herself the daughter of Ammonius, crowning her rise as heaven's will, there were those within the temple who resented her growing dominance. The god's wealth, flowing from offerings and expeditions, seemed always to circle back to her monuments, her likeness carved on every wall. Was she raising temples for the gods, or for herself? Imagine the statue halls of Karnak, lined with rows of colossal kings of old. Their faces stern, their posture eternal. And there, among them, stood Hatshepsut, sometimes as a woman, slender and robed, sometimes as a man, broad and bearded. To her allies, it was genius, she embodied both, transcending limits. To her, to pretend she had never ruled. Imagine walking through her mortuary temple in the years after her death. The walls still glowed with faint paint, but faces were missing, erased by chisels. Columns stood tall, but inscriptions had been defaced. Fragments of statues lay scattered on the desert floor, eyes without faces, crowns broken in two. The desert winds whispered through ruins that only decades before had sung her glory. Why did this happen? Was it vengeance, a son's anger at the stepmother who had overshadowed his youth? Was it fear, that her example, if remembered, might embolden others, that another woman might dare to seize the double crown? Or was it simply politics, the desire to restore the line of kings without interruption, to rewrite history as though her reign were an aberration? Historians still debate the truth. But what remains clear is this: for centuries, her story was nearly lost. Future generations of Egyptians grew up not knowing her name, walking past broken statues without asking whose face they once bore. She had ruled as pharaoh, but history itself tried to bury her. And yet, stone has a way of remembering what men try to forget. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari, though scarred, still stood. Her obelisks at Karnak still reached for the heavens, her cartouches faint but legible. The sands preserved fragments of her statues, waiting to be uncovered. And so, even as her enemies chiseled her from memory, the land itself refused to let her vanish completely. Centuries later, when archaeologists brushed away the dust, her story returned. The broken faces in the sand whispered of her courage. The walls, though scarred, still told of a queen who became king. And in that rediscovery, her triumph became eternal once more. Hatshepsut's life had been one of transformation, princess to wife, widow to regent, queen to pharaoh. And in death, she transformed yet again, from forgotten ruler to immortal legend. Her enemies thought they could erase her. Instead, they gave her story the drama of resurrection. The Nile has always been Egypt's heartbeat. Long after kings and queens have faded, its waters continue to flow, carrying whispers of the past upon their silver surface. And as the river glides beneath the stars, it carries with it the memory of a woman who dared to be more than her world allowed. Hatshepsut. The daughter of Thebes, the widow who became regent, the queen who became pharaoh. She wore the false beard of kings, not to hide who she was, but to declare that she could be both, woman and man, mortal and divine, queen and king. She reshaped the very language of power, carving her story into stone, so that even when chisels struck and names were erased, the land itself refused to forget. Imagine the Nile at night, the water dark as obsidian, reflecting the pale glow of the moon. Along its banks rise her monuments, obelisks still standing against the sky, her mortuary temple nestled against cliffs that cradle it like a mother. Arms. The faces may be broken, the names scarred, but the stones still whisper her truth. Her reign was one of peace and prosperity, of building rather than breaking, of trade rather than endless war. She proved that strength could be shown in harmony, that legacy could be built not only with swords, but with vision and resolve. And though her enemies tried to silence her, they failed. For each time the desert wind brushes across the stones of Deir el-Bahari, each time the morning sun strikes her obelisk at Karnak, her name is spoken again, not in defiance, but in endurance. So tonight, as you rest, let the story of Hatshepsut drift like the Nile itself. A reminder that even in the silence of history, courage leaves its echo. A queen who became king. A woman who defied time. Rest now, for even in stillness, the Nile remembers her name. And in its eternal flow, so shall we.